Now it's my pleasure to invite Theron Pummer to give us the next paper. Theron is a doctoral student at UC San Diego. He used to work mainly on neuroscience, but now moved to work with David Brink and Dick Arneson on a dissertation on distributive justice. And this is the first chapter that is ready. You'll give us more. He told me earlier about actually interesting connections to future chapters, which are no less intriguing than this very interesting paper. So,
thanks.
Welcome, Theron.
Thank you.
Everybody's working on monsters.
Right. Yeah. What could be more interesting than monsters? So you might remember from Dan Brock's opening remarks that the priority view is very much testing. Okay. Dan Brock's opening remarks on the priority view. My paper today addresses some theoretical concerns about the priority view. I conceive of the priority view and its main rival here, the equal weight view, as views about the moral goodness of achieving benefits for different people. And I think of a benefit as an increase in well-being for a person. And I think of the size of a benefit corresponds to the size of the increase in well-being for the person who receives it. So there are two views. The equal weight view says that only the size and number of benefits matter, and it does not ultimately matter who receives them. This view contrasts with the priority view. It says that while the size and number of benefits are relevant or matter, they're not the only things that matter. It also matters more to benefit people the worse off they are. So worse off meaning worse off in terms of their well-being level. And in discussing the relative merits of these two views, I'm going to be holding constant potentially morally relevant factors such as how deserving the individuals are, or considerations of autonomy, or considerations of deontological constraints on promoting the good. I'm going to be focusing fairly narrowly on size and number of benefits and the level of well-being of the potential recipients of those benefits prior to receiving them. One qualification about the priority view. I'm thinking that the priority view is more than just a tiebreaker. So it's more than saying when size and number are tied, or when we have one person who could receive a benefit, another person who could receive a benefit, and those benefits are the same size, we should break that tie by giving the benefit to the worse off person. I think, or at least I'm assuming for today, that the priority view is slightly stronger than that and says sometimes we should trade off overall well-being for the sake of giving priority to the worse off. Now, two more qualifications. I don't think that in setting up this debate we need to settle what well-being consists in. I think that those two views I just mentioned are sort of neutral on the question of what well-being is. There are different theories of what well-being is. Could be happiness or pleasure, could be preference satisfaction, could be achievements, or some combination of those different things. As I'm understanding the debate, though, we don't need to settle what well-being is to sensibly talk about the priority view versus the equal weight view. Also, I don't think either of these views has to take a stance on how to aggregate size and number of benefits across different persons or for different persons. So, and this would be an aggregative question, whether a million really small benefits for a million different people are as good as one really large benefit for just one person. That would be an aggregative question, trading off size and number considerations. I don't think that the equal weight view necessarily implies a particular stance about how to aggregate, and I don't think the priority view does either. Those views are about how to weight benefits, whether to weight benefits, and then if we should weight benefits according to how well off people are, to what extent we should weight them. The priority view does seem, intuitively at least, to be more plausible when we consider particular cases. So we could imagine one very familiar type of case is we could give a very large benefit to a well-off person, again, well-off in terms of well-being, or a slightly smaller benefit for somebody who's very badly off. Intuitively, it seems like it's better to provide the slightly smaller benefit for the much worse off person. The equal weight view, though, implies that we should provide the slightly larger benefit for the person who's already really well off, That seems counterintuitive. It's tempting to just conclude on the basis of those types of cases that overall the priority view must be more plausible than the equal weight view. But I think that would be too hasty. It'd be too hasty to draw that conclusion. I think there are other types of cases that we need to look at before we make that kind of overall assessment of the plausibility of the priority view compared to the equal weight view. And I try to explore some possibilities, some possible implications of the priority view using what are called spectrum arguments. So, well, what is a spectrum argument? A spectrum argument takes some series of premises which state betterness claims, and these betterness claims form an overlapping chain. So you could see B is better than A, C is better than B, B in P2 overlaps with B in P1, and so on. We can go all the way down to the second to last premise, Y is better than X, and then the last premise, Z is better than Y. And if the relation better than is transitive, if it's a transitive relation, then we can conclude, if P1 through Pn are true, that Z is better than A. I'm going to assume, for at least this first part of the discussion, that better than is a transitive relation, although that is controversial, and that's why in an appendix of my paper I argue that I can still run this spectrum argument and other spectrum arguments even if transitivity is false, but that's maybe a detail that we could explore later. So then my particular first spectrum argument substitutes in A through Z for those outcomes. So outcome A is a large benefit. You could imagine it's relief from pain for 2 years for a moderately badly off person. We could say more to specify what a moderately badly off person is. Maybe a moderately badly off person has a life worth living, or maybe not. That's a detail we could get into. But outcome B contains a somewhat smaller benefit, maybe relief from pain for a year and 11 months. And so it's a slightly smaller benefit than the benefit in A. But the person who receives it is much worse off than the person who received the larger benefit in A. And if we were convinced of the priority view, it seems like we'd want to say B is better than A. Then we could modify C so that the benefit there is slightly smaller and the person who receives the benefit is much worse off. And again, if we like the priority view, we might want to say C is better than B. And so on, all the way down to Z, we get this tiny, piddling benefit, relief of a headache, or relief from pain for 15 minutes, something fairly small, for an extremely badly off person, somebody who's maybe endured hell for 100 years or something. Now, if premises P1 through Pn are true, then transitivity implies that outcome Z is better than outcome A. But just thinking about this intuitively at least, it seems wrong. It seems false that Z is better than A. It seems better to provide that large benefit, relief from pain for 2 years, for the moderately badly off person than to provide the really small benefit for the incredibly or extremely badly off person. Insofar as the priority view has the implication that Z is better than A, that seems an embarrassing implication. This is just a reminder of what I said earlier. The priority view, I'm taking the priority view to be more than just a tiebreaker view. So I think the sort of minimum commitment going beyond a tiebreaker view would be the priority view says that there's some trade-off T of the form it's better to achieve a slightly smaller benefit for a significantly worse off person than to achieve a slightly larger benefit for a significantly better off person. And you can change what slightly smaller means and what significantly worse off means. That's just the form of the trade-off that I think any version of the priority view would have to accept if it goes beyond a mere tiebreaker view. But the acceptance of, so that's what T is going to stand for. The acceptance of T would not by itself commit the priority view to P1 through Pn. It's possible to accept some really modest trade-off of overall well-being for the sake of giving priority to the worse off. It's possible to accept such a trade-off and reject some of the premises in the spectrum argument. But we can make the premises of that spectrum argument arbitrarily weak. We can make them as weak as we like by altering how we specified outcomes A through Z. We can also have, so A through Z doesn't mean there's 26 outcomes, by the way. There could be hundreds or millions. I'm just using A through Z because it's easy to think about the start of a series and the end of a series. But we could make the premises of the spectrum argument arbitrarily weak by making the difference in size between adjacent benefits arbitrarily small, and by making the size difference between how well off the people are in adjacent steps arbitrarily large. So we could imagine that each benefit is 99%. Each benefit is 99% the size of its predecessor, or each life is 10 or 100 times worse off than her predecessor. So then it seems to me that no matter how weak or modest T was, the premise or the minimum step that the priority view had to take to go beyond a mere tiebreaker view, we could construct P1 through Pn so that they're actually weaker than that. And I've sort of put this in terms of the following claim. Conditional trade-offs says if any priority-driven trade-off, T, so T would be a priority-driven trade-off, is plausible, then each of the individual trade-offs that collectively comprise P1 through Pn could be made at least as plausible. Seems hard to deny that. Denying that is itself counterintuitive, because we'd be saying, well, while some trade-offs are plausible, trade-offs that are weaker than that are implausible. It's weird. It's already weird to say that they would be less plausible if they were weaker. But but it'd be even weirder to say that while T is plausible, we could imagine these weaker trade-offs being actually implausible. So I think conditional trade-offs is a difficult claim to deny. This then leads to a dilemma, I think, for the priority view. So either the priority view or the equal weight view has the option of accepting or rejecting conditional trade-offs. So let's look at the priority view first. I just said that if it rejects conditional trade-offs, that's implausible. That's sort of implausible on its face. So let's look at the other option. Well, if it accepts conditional trade-offs, then that's going to commit it to P1 through Pn, because it accepts the antecedent of conditional trade-offs, that there is some priority-driven trade-off that's plausible. And so since P1 through Pn are weaker than it, they'll be plausible too. But then that implies that, with given transitivity again, that Z is better than A, and that's implausible. So whether the priority view accepts or rejects conditional trade-offs, it has an implausible implication. The equal weight view can accept conditional trade-offs, though. So it has the option of accepting or rejecting conditional trade-offs. I don't think it should reject it. I don't think we should reject it. But it can accept conditional trade-offs. It can say, yes, if any priority-driven trade-off is true, then P1 through Pn could be made at least as plausible. But there is no priority-driven trade-off that's plausible. There is no such trade-off. So the antecedent of that conditional is false. So it doesn't imply that P1 through Pn are true, and so it doesn't imply that Z is better than A. So you can see the equal weight view can avoid a certain type of implausibility that the priority view has to face. But so what should we conclude from that? I think we have to conclude that the equal weight view is more plausible than the priority view in one respect. It's more plausible in the respect that, well, it avoids that dilemma I just mentioned. That seems true. But where should we go from that in terms of the debate between the priority view and the equal weight view? Well, I think that's less clear. So we could accept the modest claim that I just mentioned and still be sympathetic toward the priority view. We could say, well, yes, the modest claim is true, but overall, on balance, the priority view is more plausible. That's one possibility. Another possibility is, which I don't list here, which is to endorse a kind of agnosticism or provisional agnosticism about which view is better. We might think, well, we've got this evidence on one side and this evidence on the other side, and it's not clear how to balance it. So maybe we should sort of withhold claiming which view is more plausible until we've looked at more evidence or until we've thought about this evidence more carefully. Then another conclusion, a third conclusion we could draw is the extreme claim. We could think that the drawbacks of the equal weight view are less severe, less problematic than those of the priority view. And so the equal weight view is overall more plausible than the priority view. That's another way we could go. So that was one spectrum argument. In my paper, I talk about two, but there are actually more than two. But let me just quickly mention the second prominent one in the paper. So the first one dealt with a spectrum where the benefits were progressively decreased in size. We could cook up another spectrum argument where the number of benefits are decreased rather than their size. And the number could be decreased while the size remains constant. So we could take, for example, and again, this is just an example. I'm not claiming the priority view has to be committed to this, but suppose a version of the priority view does accept that it's better to provide 1,000 benefits for 1,000 badly off people, so that's one benefit per person, than it is to provide 1,001 benefits for 1,001 slightly less badly off people. Okay, so I should say a little bit more about that. We could assume that the benefit is a pretty significant benefit. It's not a trivial benefit. It's relief from pain for a year. So that's a big deal, relief from pain for a year. The badly off people, maybe they're badly off because they suffer from some crippling disease. And the slightly less badly off people also suffer from that same crippling disease, but they are slightly less badly off because they suffer fewer sore throats, let's say. Maybe they have, on average, one fewer sore throat per year. That would be very slightly less badly off, and we could vary it a little bit, but that would be one way of imagining how those people are slightly less badly off. Okay, so with that trade-off in place, 1,000 benefits for badly off people is better than 1,001 for 1,001 slightly less badly off people. If the priority view accepts that trade-off, we could bring a spectrum argument to show that the priority view would be committed to the conclusion that it's better to achieve these benefits for 1 billion badly off people than it is to achieve them for 1 billion plus 1 million more slightly less badly off people. So this is really just multiplying that trade-off by 1 million. And I could show you, I mean, maybe you don't need me to show a spectrum argument to get that conclusion. Maybe it's obvious that if we accept transitivity and we accept a certain type of spectrum argument that that conclusion would follow from that initial trade-off. Maybe that's obvious. But if the priority view did have that implication, I think, again, that would be another embarrassing feature of or implication of the priority view. Seems that we've got group 1, some badly off people, and group 2, some slightly less badly off people. Seems implausible to me that we would forego providing an additional 1 million benefits for group 2 just because the people in that group have one fewer sore throat a year. So I'm going to conclude and summarize at the same time. So the priority view appears to be more plausible than the equal weight view in certain familiar cases, like the one I mentioned at the very beginning. But then I mentioned a couple other types of maybe less familiar cases where the priority view seems less plausible. And I think those cases need to be taken into account. Large number cases like the utility monster and the repugnant conclusion figure quite prominently in debates about aggregation, interpersonal aggregation of benefits. But the types of large number cases I was talking about just now don't really get discussed or explored very carefully in debates about how to weight or set the priority weighting of benefits. But I think we should look at those sorts of cases, and that we would need to before we make sort of an all things considered or overall judgment about whether the priority view is more plausible than the equal weight view. I think we need to look at all the relevant evidence before we make that sort of claim. And I don't think that the evidence I bring up is necessarily decisive against the priority view, but I think it needs to be taken into account. And so I hope that these types of spectrum arguments will at least provide for a more judicious debate between the two views. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to respond, we'll have Greg Bogner, who is currently here at the BioEthics program. He's also previously a postdoc at our program at Harvard. And not just in the future, I think already now Greg is a very felt presence across the field of population-level bioethics with great papers published in the best venues on a variety of the most important questions in the field.
Wow.
I want to begin with... yeah, I'll get back to him. I want to begin by thanking Theron for sharing his paper. I really enjoyed working on it. And I should say that we spent the last week, 10 days, basically in daily email contact, debating these issues. And ultimately, I think our views are closer than we originally thought. So Theron defends or is attracted to a family of views that we could call the equal weight view, where benefits have the same moral weight no matter who receives these benefits, and the benefit to a person who is worse off has the same weight than a benefit, equal benefit to the better off. One example of this view would be one type of, or some types of utilitarianism, on which basically you give the same weight to all the benefits and then you add them up. As somewhat simplified, it's up there. So we can put that view, this sort of equal weight view, up on this simple graph where along the horizontal axis we have well-being and sizes of benefits, whereas on the vertical axis we measure the moral weight that we give to those different benefits. So the equal weight view would say that no matter where you fall along the horizontal axis, all that matters is the size of the benefit. It's going to have the same value, or it's going to have an equal moral weight. So what is distinct about the priority view, or the family of views, which are prioritarian views, is that they hold that the benefit has more moral value or greater moral weight if it goes to a person who is worse off. So what we do here is that we don't just take people's well-being or people's benefits, but we actually weight them with some particular weighting function. There are many possibilities, and prioritarianism says that that function is going to be increasing and strictly concave. Okay, so basically, if we go back to the graph, what is distinct about the prioritarian view is that it says that the moral weight of the benefits, as I have them on the vertical axis, is going to differ depending on where the people who get the benefits A and B, there are two benefits, fall on the horizontal axis. So Theron's argument, at least one of the arguments, the main argument, is this first spectrum argument, where you have basically a sequence going from A to Z, whereas he presented it, we're going from a large benefit for a moderately badly off person, which is supposed to be worse than a somewhat smaller benefit for a worse off person. And finally, we end up with Z, where you have a very small benefit for an extremely badly off person. And although at each step it seems that it's better than the previous one, he thinks that it's intuitively obvious, or very counterintuitive to think that that Z cannot actually be better than A. Well, this is basically the spectrum argument going back to the simple graphs that I use. We go from A to Z, and we can see that as you go back from the right to the smaller and smaller benefits, because of what prioritarians say about the moral weight of benefits, it might be that there is moral value for these smaller benefits. One obvious reply that prioritarians can give is that, well, maybe we just chose the wrong function. We can change our weighting function so that we can come up with a version of prioritarianism, which when we apply it to Theron's first spectrum argument, is not going to have this conclusion, so that Z is not going to end up better as A. So the moral value on the vertical axis of A is slightly larger than the moral value of benefit C. It doesn't really come across, but it actually is. Okay. But of course, Theron would say that, well, that's not a really good reply, because you can set up any or choose any sort of weighting function, and he can come up with this spectrum argument. He can come up with the sequence that will generate a counterintuitive result at the end. So there is going to be this sequence where it's intuitively obvious that the final step is not going to be better than the first step. But of course, that's possible, but then we've made this assumption, if we accept that there is this best or correct or right weighting function, that all the judgments in this sequence were also intuitively obvious. If that assumption is denied, then again, we just chose the wrong weighting function to represent the moral value of the benefits. But if we chose the right function, then why should we accept the final intuition? That is to say, we have the right function from A to Z. There are all these intuitively obvious moral judgments, and now at the end, we have one judgment that conflicts with that. Well, maybe we could just reject that, because we have so many supporting intuitions. I'm not denying any of the intuitions that Theron and others might have about these cases, and but I think that what the argument really is about is not an objection to prioritarianism or the prioritary view as such, but it raises a very important and interesting issue about the use of moral intuitions in moral theory. So I really want to talk about that, the remaining of my comments. So for instance, in the second spectrum argument, which Theron didn't present in detail, but basically here you vary the number of people, and you get from this 1 billion, 1 million better of people to a case where you have basically no benefit for these better of people, but same benefits for 1 billion worse of people. So where you end up is the counterintuitive result that the benefits to 1 billion worse of people would have more moral weight than the same benefits to 1 million more better of people. What I want to say about this argument, of course, is that you can always make a spectrum argument like that. You can always come up with a sequence which will generate a counterintuitive result at the end. So if you go back to the equal weight view, if we start, say, changing the size of the benefit and the number of people who receive those benefits, we could build a very similar spectrum argument as the second one for the equal weight view, which would end up basically with the counterintuitive result that benefits to 1 billion well of people will be better than benefits half their size to 2 billion minus 1 badly of people. So the point I'm trying to make here is that no matter what theory you take about the moral weight of benefits, there is going to be some sequence that you can generate that will lead to a counterintuitive result at the end. And again, I think that really raises this question about the use of intuitions. Maybe one position you could take is that we should accept all moral intuitions, for maybe they reveal something important about morality, so that there might be a deep structure of morality, and all these intuitions are a way to access them. But of course, given that we can always come up with these sort of examples, then no known moral theory, at least the ones we have now, is going to fit this structure. And I think that's slightly problematic. But also, if it turns out that our intuitions are always going to contain inconsistencies, then I think there is a reason to doubt that we have a deep structure of morality at all. It's in square quotes, of course, but because it's really not a structure if what we have are inconsistent intuitions. So I think we should be prepared to reject some of the intuitions, whether or not there is this deep moral structure that is revealed by them. And we should just accept the best supported theory and stop worrying about isolated counterexamples. Of course, things are more complicated than that. But for instance, I think a prioritarian can reasonably make the argument that in the second spectrum argument, we had 1 million intuitively obvious steps and one counterexample why worry about that one counterexample? So I think the real implication and the important point that Theron's paper raises through all of these examples and arguments is that if we take all of our intuitions seriously, either we have to reject all of the moral theories, or we have to start thinking about when and how we should be prepared to accept or reject some of these intuitions, and just choose the best moral view ultimately. Okay, so that I think that is the main question that is raised here. I want to finish by sort of extending this and say something about how these arguments or this question relates to the topic of this conference. So, of course, when it comes to healthcare and environmental policy, then we do use intuitions very often. There are extensive empirical studies where we test, ask people about their moral judgments or their preferences, and see how they would evaluate different health states or disabilities, say, what sort of risks they want to avoid, and so on and so forth. So cost-utility analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis involve many of the intuitions that people give. In environmental policy, contingent valuation and other studies also rely on people's judgments or intuitions. And of course, there's always going to be inconsistencies in that case. So I think the practical issue is that, well, how do we, well, on the one hand, we can and we should impose consistency on some of these valuations. But on the other hand, I think we have interesting questions there when or whether you want to accept or reject people's intuitions. Okay.
So, okay, and so it needs to get arbitrarily steep in order for my arguments to work, even the less extreme argument that the conclusion I was trying to argue for. Okay, so then in terms of conditional trade-offs, that version of the priority view would reject it. It would reject conditional trade-offs then. So I agree that there are versions of the priority view like that that would be able to avoid those problems, but I mean, I think we would need some independent reason for rejecting those trade-offs really far down the spectrum. And when I look at, whatever trade-off T the priority view accepts, and then look at these other trade-offs down Pn-1 or Pn or whatever, and look at them in isolation of this whole spectrum argument, just compare them. I don't see why we couldn't make the Pn just as intuitively plausible as whatever trade-off T you're going to pick. So I'm not sure how it's a possible version of the priority view, but I'm not sure how plausible it would be independently of avoiding the counterintuitive implication that I wanted it to generate. I actually think that pointing out that resources have different effects on people's well-being or benefits, depending on how badly off they are, can actually help soften up some of the counterintuitiveness of the equal weight view in the first place. And so I would agree with you that there is at least a strategic or rhetorical point there. So I don't think that would be a problem, but I want to clarify, I am talking about increases in well-being, and so there is just a stipulation that, when I say an increase, we've already adjusted for maybe the causal effect of being badly off on what happens to the resource. I think that's right, that the that the tiebreaker view doesn't have the counterintuitive implications that I was talking about here, and I didn't intend to argue against it. I think I can run the spectrum argument against versions of the priority view that say that how we weight benefits matters above and below certain thresholds. And I could sort of have different arguments against different parts of the weighting function. So say below the threshold, I think, I could just stipulate that in all the outcomes, A through Z, the lives aren't worth living. So they'd all be below the threshold already, and then run the argument as before. I think then we would have to give some defense of the significance of that particular threshold. So, I mean, maybe a natural place to look is the life worth living or not worth living. That seems like a reasonable place to look. But I think that whatever intuition we had above the threshold, when we look at, say, a really well-off person or a not as well-off person, both lives are definitely worth living. So we have some prioritarian intuition there. And then we look below the threshold, and we've got two people whose lives aren't worth living, one way worse off, though. I mean, one person, say, is in hell for 100 years, and the other person's in hell for 1,000 years. It seems to me that the intuition that we should provide this slightly smaller benefit for the worse off person there rather than the slightly larger benefit for the better off person, that seems just as secure as the priority trade-offs above that threshold. So I'm not particularly convinced that even though that threshold would look like a natural threshold to draw, I'm not really convinced that the priority function could be defended above but not below. Well, I guess, I could maybe appeal to something Matthew said, that maybe there's some factor here, it's not a benefit we're distributing, it's a resource, and the benefit is the result of how the resource interacts with the person. And so maybe the really badly off person is a worse converter of the type of resource that's available into benefit. So maybe I would have to tell the story a little bit. I hope that my arguments target all versions of the priority view except for the tiebreaker version. And regarding the original position, I think we do have to still rely on intuitions when we set up the original position. And we are going to be begging certain questions, I think, if we don't face up to the fact that we are relying on intuitions when we specify that the original position is this way as opposed to that way. So I guess I don't really think there is a way of justifying the priority view or any view about weighting benefits for that matter besides appealing to intuitions at some point.
Well, no, but I say it anyway. So, for instance, your simple view might be the sort of argument that you had a million supporting intuitions in favor of a view, and now you have one or two isolated counterexamples. I don't think we should worry about that. But when it comes to, for instance, the empirical stuff, we might want to actually rely on some of that. So if it turns out that when we ask people about resource allocation in health, and they don't seem to give us trade-offs which assume which would support the equal weight view, as I think empirical results don't, I think that's a reason to think more highly about or be more attracted to something like the priority view. So I think it makes a difference that when we look at these intuitions, many people seem to share those intuitions. Many people share some sort of a prioritarian intuition as opposed to an equal weight intuition. That might be the beginnings of some sort of an account of how you deal with this.
So first there's an issue about how we individuate separate intuitions about separate cases in the first place. And then I think even if we did have a good theory of how to do that, such that each of the steps in the spectrum argument counted as a separate intuition for the priority view, it wouldn't be at all obvious to me that those add up to a stronger intuitive case for the priority view than the single intuition that A is better than Z. I mean, the strength of the intuition might have some sort of dominance over the number of intuitions. I mean, just reporting my own sort of phenomenology about this, when I think about each of the trade-offs in the spectrum argument, I think that they're each intuitive, but I could deny them. I feel like I could believe that they're false. But the claim that Z is better than A, I can't believe that. It's just I have a way stronger intuition there.
That's absolutely true, and I agree with our views are closer than they were initially. But I also think there is something strange about this methodology that says that when health economists look at these results and play these games with people, they are really worried about methodology. And there's a lot written about the biases, the heuristics, and all the ways people's intuitions and moral judgments can go wrong. But it seems that in moral philosophy, we don't worry about these at all. It's a good argument that I have this very strong intuition, and my view is that I don't trust my intuitions because I could go just as badly off as many of these empirical studies. So I don't have a good account for how to take into account intuitions, but I think we should be more suspicious of them in moral philosophy.
I think I agree with that, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I had been phrasing it in terms of moral goodness, so I had been phrasing it as an argument against telic prioritarianism. But I think I could extend it to an argument against deontic prioritarianism too, if we thought that transitivity still applied when we were talking about deontic terms rather than just telic terms. So I don't see why my argument couldn't be extended to an argument against telic prioritarianism. I mean, I had been phrasing it as an argument against telic prioritarianism. I don't see why what the wall in between telic and deontic is, at least as far as my argument is concerned. I would just say I could specify D and C so that that claim would be implausible. It'd be implausible to accept some of the trade-offs, but not that one.
If I understand correctly, point is, no matter how you generate prioritarianism, whether the ground for this theory is Rawlsian or whatever, when you have a certain set of assumptions, you reach a difficult situation. In fact, I wanted to encourage Theron to extend this to another theory, namely telic egalitarianism. I think faces the same problem. Right. So, partly because, as some economists have shown, under plausible assumptions, it generates the exact same output as prioritarianism. If you add to it some aggregative element, as you probably should. I do have a challenge, which is I'm not sure that you need the spectrum argument, which is anyhow somewhat suspect of some issues like psoriasis complications, to generate the conclusion that to give a very small benefit to somebody just because they're so much worse off than the others is problematic. It is problematic, intuitively it's problematic, and prioritarianism, you can show, is committed to this problematic view, just because if you look at the formulation, it will have that implication. So we forget about all the middle part.
Okay, I think that that's right for some ways of specifying the prioritarian weighting function, but I don't think that that's always the case. So we could accept a kind of discontinuity view that says a large benefit always matters more than a small benefit, no matter how badly off the recipient of the small benefit is. But I think then we would need a spectrum argument supplemented with transitivity to target that sort of discontinuity view, and we couldn't generate the implication that Z is better than A just by looking at the weighting function alone, at least for some versions of the priority view. And so I think the advantage of using spectrum arguments is that they really do target all versions of the priority view except for the tiebreaker kind of view.
Any more questions, or I think we're at the end of our time, so let's thank the speakers.